Okay. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to the Harper's home. This is our living room. I'm Eric Harper.
I'm Julie Cancio Harper.
And we were asked by Karen Schubert at Lit Youngstown to take part in a video series that just looks at couples who are also writers, like writers who are cohabitating, who are partners, and who also collaborate creatively in one way or another. And so that's what we are going to talk about. And now that we've got that set up, I can put this aside. This is Karen's email with instructions. Thank you, Karen. So I guess the first question is, how do we make all of this work?
It's really weird. It's kind of always been this way. Since we met in college, I've never had a relationship with you that writing wasn't a part of.
Yeah, that's true.
We met in 1994.
We met when we were 19.
First year of Kenyon College, and I guess books and writing and talking about them and critiquing them and exchanging ideas, that is all part of how we fell in love. So I don't think there is any Harpers without reading and writing and lots of talk.
That's true. In a way, it happened so organically that there wasn't ever really a transition. In fact, I think that we were creating creative collaborators before we were actually romantically involved. Because like I can remember going to the Taco Bell in Mount Vernon, Ohio with you and other friends, and my discussing creative writing ideas with you and getting your feedback, and we were only friends at the time. So like in a way, the surprise was when we fell in love.
That's true.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's been a long time ago now, and over the years we've kind of fallen into different areas of interest. And even though we don't share the same particular writing genres, I think that almost makes our input the better, because I know more about your genres than a person who doesn't read them, but I have a lot of other influences to bring, new ideas to bring from, say, I'm mostly interested in poetry and nonfiction, and like over the years, also because we worked in video production and film, some writing for the screen.
Yep.
Whereas Eric, his interests lie in...
Oh, I'm definitely a genre reader and a genre writer. So I tend to, I read a lot of thrillers, I read a lot of classic thrillers, detective fiction, adventure fiction, and so forth. And that tends to be where my viewing interests lie too, you know, in terms of movies and television. And so that's what I always aspired to write. And I, even from a young age, like when I have always had the identity of a writer. So I've sort of been blessed in that way, that I grew up in a household and a family that encouraged that in me. The first thing that I remember writing was a book that I wrote when I was 6 years old about a balloon journey around the world. Before I knew that was already a thing, like that Jules Verne had beat me to it. I wrote that and I was very excited about it. And even though I come from a largely working class family, people just thought that I was neat, thought that I was interesting, and always sort of gave me encouragement as well as constructive criticism. Because it wasn't always a love fest. My dad in particular went out of his way to give me constructive criticism. But I've always had that identity as a writer, and I've always had an interest in genre storytelling.
Definitely fiction-based for you all the way.
Yes, absolutely.
Recently, though, because it's been a little while since we met, we've been influencing each other in subtle ways over the years. A lot of our projects, sometimes it's hard to tell who originated the idea. Someone comes up with something in conversation, you're at coffee on a Saturday morning, and you think, what would be neat? What would be neat if... And years ago, Eric came up with the idea, like, he wanted to write a screenplay that featured some guy in handcuffs, and that's all he started with.
Right, like where the whole story was a guy who at the beginning is stuck in handcuffs, and he spends the entire screen time trying to get out of them.
Yep. And we've been carrying that around in our back pocket for quite some time now.
Oh yeah, probably 20 years.
And gosh, in the last year, I finally had some time to spread my wings and try some new stuff. Eric has been asking me to write a screenplay ever since he was in college when he went to grad school for film. And I always shied away from it, even though Eric's had a very strong identity as a writer his whole life. I've been kind of, a person who wrote for myself, not really to publish or to read for other people.
And if I can interrupt for a second,
Sure.
To me, like ever since I've known you, I always considered you a writer. I thought your identity was that of a writer before you ever did. So now that like there's a new degree of your blossoming, it's very exciting for me to see.
Well, I definitely think that like social anxiety has played a role in whether or not I was willing to share or not share. And as I've been addressing anxiety in my life over the last couple of years, I feel more open, not only to share those things, but also to try new forms. So starting last August, I got an idea that I wanted to write a screenplay for the first time. And it's the first fiction I think I've written since I was in grade school, maybe.
No, you've worked on fiction since then.
Not in earnest like this.
True.
Like, this is a pretty serious project. And I guess the reason why I'm thinking of this in particular today is because while we're here in April 2020, working from home, living from home, doing everything more or less together the way that we did for a long time when we were self-employed years ago, I feel more open and free to try new things. So I pulled some story elements out of my own life, and then I started to have a process that was alarmingly like Eric's. I'm normally a very linear writer. Eric is a non-linear writer. He will get a scene. This is how fiction works inside his head. He's got 7 different tracks of things running all at the same time, and only one of them is his real life. And then on one of those, he has an open channel and a scene will download into his head, and he'll think, oh, that's interesting. What's that person doing? Mm-hmm. Well, for the first time in my life, I got a scene. And there's a woman, and she's sitting at a table, and she's dealing tarot cards. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to give this a try. I'm going to see where it takes me. So I take my linear brain on this little trip, and I'm going to read, with Eric's help, the opening scene of this unnamed screenplay that I've been working on a little bit.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk a little bit
pull out
about
a recent work of mine.
your story.
Yep.
And then we'll read that.
Great. Now, and for just a little further introduction, like the basic premise of your script does involve a person stuck in a pair of handcuffs. And I think that that's really neat because I never did anything with that idea. You know what I mean? For me, it was like something that I thought that I could sell if I could find the heart to write it. And for you, you had always loved that notion. And so it became yours. Like it's your idea.
It was never a gimmick to me.
Right, exactly.
I always thought it had a lot of like interior human motivation that I wanted to ask questions about.
Right. And so like that means it was always your idea. And I think it's
Okay.
very cool to see it blossoming.
So here's an idea that started with something Eric said probably 15 years ago or more. And this is the
On
little...
a coffee date, probably.
Probably on a coffee date. And I'm going to be reading stage direction, and Eric is going to be playing for me the role of the security guard number 2 and the young man. I will be reading for Jean.
Okay, and I'm going to come a little closer because
Yeah.
we're sharing a copy.
Cuddle up.
Oh, hello, love.
So, exterior, Jean's tent, day. Jean's point of view. Middle-aged woman's hands in extreme close-up, shuffle, cut, and deal a deck of tarot cards. Her nails are short and trim, but unpainted. She wears no rings. Exterior street fair, day. Point of view of young man, running full tilt through a crowded street fair. He has his hands out in front of him, and the rest is blurred tunnel vision of people and attractions and colorful vendor signs. Exterior, Jean's tent. Day. Jean's point of view. She lays a 3-card spread on the tabletop and turns over the first card. We can see that there are vendors across the street and people passing by, but she focuses on the image in the first card, the Fool. There's no one across from her. She's reading for herself. Her left index finger scratches the tablecloth. Exterior, street fair. Day. Point of view of young man. He's staying low, dodging fairgoers as quietly as he can, but still bumping some. He sees feet and the business alleys between food trailers and casts his gaze to the left and right quickly, searching for an open path or refuge. Exterior, Jean's tent. Day. Jean turns the second card in the spread over with her right hand. The 8 of Wands. Exterior, street fair. Day. Young man approaches a cross street, and the last booth on the right is a plain white Easy Up with white signs printed with handmade black letters offering free water and free readings. The tent is not crowded. There's just a woman sitting at a table dealing cards. The tablecloth is round and ill-fitting for a rectangular folding table, so it only covers the middle of the table down to the ground. Under the table, there's a cooler, and on the left, and there are cases of water stacked up on the right. Exterior, Jean's tent. Day. Jean looks up, and at the left corner of her tent, as the young man hurtles in, tucks and rolls on the ground, and lands firmly underneath the table where she sits. 2 sets of heavy footsteps are heard approaching at a run. Security guard number 1 stops in front of Jean's tent, doubled over and panting. Reverse shot of table shows Jean, but no visible young man under the table. Security guard number 2 arrives a second behind, looks up and down the cross street, then turns to Jean.
Have you seen a guy in handcuffs run through here?
What does he look like? Security guard number 1 has caught her breath enough and begins charging forward down the street again, wordless. Security guard number 2 feels the need to run ahead with her and shouts back at Jean as he runs away.
I don't know.
Jean and a few nearby pedestrians watch the security guards disappear from sight. After a beat, everyone else goes back to their business. Jean lifts the tablecloth partially, and the young man peers out right away. He's holding his knees to his chest, and we can't see his wrists. We're focused on his face as he looks straight at Jean. What are you doing? She lifts the tablecloth up onto the tabletop, revealing the young man. He puts his hands out defensively toward her. The cuffs fill her vision.
I don't know. Honestly, I'm trying to figure that out right now.
Jean looks around and no one is watching her tent. She turns the cards on the table face down. She stands up, gathers the deck, blesses it, puts it in the pouch, and packs it into her large tote bag. She pushes the chair back from the table. Come up here and sit. He does so, keeping his hands out of sight in his lap below the table level. Jean puts her large tote bag on top of his hands. Hold this. Jean neatly folds the tablecloth and puts it in the tote bag. She crosses the tent to 2 signs she has up with Velcro, and she rips them down.
Would you tell me what you're doing?
She turns to face him. I'm closing down. Jean stacks the signs on the tabletop and weights them down with a rock.
I mean, why give away free stuff in a tent? Everyone else is selling things.
Jean shrugs. Sometimes people need help. She grabs the handle of her wheeled cooler. Let's take a walk. The young man stands up, carrying the tote bag from underneath, and he exits with Jean through the rear of the tent, going uphill on the side street.
And scene.
So,
Yeah. I think the thing that's really neat about that, the way your script is developed, is that typically we think differently. I mean,
Yes.
like our thought processing is different. We usually come to the same conclusion, but from opposite directions.
Right.
So, like, you know, I'm not at all a type A person. Like, as you said, like only one of the tracks in my brain is ever on real life. So, like, you know, I might know what kind of hat someone wore in 1850s New York, but I don't know what time the bank closes. You know,
that is
as
often
we've talked
the
about.
case.
Whereas you, I wouldn't call you type A, but I think that you're more type A than I am. Like the way you approach writing typically is a lot more structured. And so for you to have a scene download was very exciting because it's like a different realm for you.
It's exciting and it's also terrifying because I have no idea how this story ends.
Right.
Right now that's 3 pages. It's about 20 pages long at this point. I have no idea. I have no idea what's going to happen
Right.
to these characters, but I am really enjoying falling in love with them as I show up to work on it.
Yeah, you seem to have enjoyed the process.
Definitely.
You know, it's funny too because, like, like I said, although you're more type A than me, right? Like, although you're not type A, like you tend to be more structured. And the interesting thing about the way you've approached the script is that the scene that downloaded into your head turned out to be, at least so far, the opening scene. Mm-hmm. And so you began writing not knowing where that was going, you know, which is what most writers would call writing by the seat of your pants, the seat of your pants. Whereas me, who's much more a seat of the pants kind of personality,
Yes.
like I'm a fanatical outliner. Like the first scene I get might be random, and usually if I wind up using that scene, it shows up somewhere in the middle of the story. But then I build a scenario around it. I'm like, well, what kind of person? Who is this person? What kind of person would find themselves in that situation? You know. And then I build the story around that. So I might come up with that scene, and then it provokes an idea about a beat far down the road, or it brings forth an idea about like where the story might start. So like I'm not building it in a linear fashion, but I don't start writing until
you
all
know.
of those elements are in place. So I build it in a non-linear fashion, but I have to write it like through the outline, like following that outline. Whereas you, each action that has happened in this work in progress is what informs you of what's going to happen next. So you
Yes.
literally have not known where it's going, and I find that very exciting.
Thank you.
Also, I can't imagine doing it myself.
Well,
It's scary.
speaking of which, like how do we work together and how does the interplay of our ideas inflect in the process that we have developed individually? Like when I'm writing this script, I'm literally, whenever I have a couple, 45 minutes to a 4-hour block, depending, if I have time to sit down and work on it, I'm going to write what I've got. And then that day, at the end of the day, when Eric comes home from work, I let him read whatever new scene has come to the fore. And his encouragement in that process, like normally Eric does not share works in progress. Normally I do not share works in progress. But for that particular story, the momentum of it seems to really benefit from having his encouragement on a daily basis that he, like, I'm trying to keep the momentum going in a way that makes you want to, run ahead to the next scene with the characters and knowing that he's there to verify for me at the end of the day that the momentum that I'm hoping is there is really there has been part of the encouragement that's gotten me to 20 plus pages where I'm at at the present.
Right. It's funny that you mentioned that because one of Karen Schubert's questions was about how we accommodate each other's writing time, and for the life we have now, on the one hand, we don't really have like a discipline, like a schedule of I write during this time and you write during that time. We write as we find the time, but also because like creative collaboration has been part of our life since the beginning. We're kind of always working on it, you know. So what we're stealing are moments to sit down and type in a lot of ways, but we're both always thinking about our works in
Right.
progress.
The
you know?
ideas are flowing in an ongoing way.
Right.
Especially with the project that Eric is working on now. He is working on a universe that at this moment has 2 different novels inside it. And the backstory and the origin of the character and his motivations across what amounts to a lifespan
It's true.
is definitely taking more prep time than you're used to.
It is, and more prep time than I had even intended. When I started writing the current work in progress, when I started outlining it, I told myself this is going to be a novella because it had been quite a while since I committed to a very long story idea. Probably 15 years at least. I've been working in short fiction a lot, and also Julie and I have a background in film and television production. We had our own video production company, so we collaborated on scripts for a lot of documentaries for nonprofits, commercials, and things like that.
So you're getting back to your fiction muscles at
I
this
am.
point.
So I decided at a certain point that I wanted more of my creative time for myself, because if you spend all day writing for other people, you don't have energy to write for yourself. And
Yeah.
that's what I wanted.
You use all those decisions, those creative decisions, for mercenary work
Exactly.
instead of for your own.
Exactly. So I had to tell myself a story that the work in progress that I started was a novella, so that it would give me the confidence to get started by saying, well, it's not going to be too long. And then as I began to develop it, I needed some backstory, obviously, and then the backstory began to develop so coherently that I was like, well, this is a whole other story. Like, what's at stake in the
Guys,
origin story
it's a
is not
pretty-
actually
It's a pretty meaty prequel, is what it's turning into.
right.
It's a really fine
Right.
origin.
Yeah. Well, and all of which is to say that this is something that Julie and I have been discussing in kind of an ongoing way since at least October, when I committed to that idea. And so, although we're not collaborating on that piece of writing, like I'm not collaborating with Julie except to give her basic feedback on her screenplay, it's something that comes up frequently in our conversation. So we might be making dinner together or doing laundry or washing dishes, and I'll bring up an issue that I'm trying to sort out, and she'll give me feedback on it. So that's sort of like the kind of collaboration that we typically have. Like
We
it's
were at the
an
library
ongoing
book
process.
sale. And as we're going to the library book sale, I'm going to be looking for nonfiction books because that's where I tend to read. And I noticed that they had a book that was the history of the Los Angeles Times, back to the origin of the paper, which the origin of the paper predates the 1925 date that Eric is sort of like working around. And I thought to myself, oh, like this is right in his wheelhouse. It's the right geography. It's the right time. Like he might benefit from knowing what was going on at the LA Times, even though the LA Times doesn't figure in the story. But I was like, yoink, we need that.
Because it provides context.
Right.
And that's something that you're great at. Like,
Grist
that's
for the
something that
mill.
You provide a lot of for me, like helping me to sort of like shape and frame a notion when I'm working on it.
Well, I mean, before I was able to even say I was a writer, I was happy to call myself an editor. I worked in the publishing industry for 10 years before we did film and television. So I feel very comfortable and confident editing and analyzing and looking for holes in narrative arguments. And so I really love being your first reader because of that. Because our processes are so different, I'm going to always have a little bit of something to offer you. Even in a piece that comes out as well as the one that you're about to read now. By the time you finally showed it to me, it was darn near done.
That's true. Julie read from a work in progress. I'm not going to do that because I'm not as far along. So instead, I'm going to read a short story that was published last year. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background on it. I identify as a genre writer. So I have written mystery, thriller, that sort of thing, crime stories and whatnot. And in my younger days, a lot of comedy. Like I was very interested in writing comedy. And as a genre, although I've always loved watching and reading Westerns, I never had any intention of writing one myself. And then several years ago, I got acquainted with some writers out west, a Western novelist and publisher named Scott Harris, who's a best-selling Western author, and a writer named Paul Bishop. They both live on the West Coast, and Paul Bishop was an LAPD detective for 30 years and a very successful one. And during that time, he was also writing. And Paul and Scott began collaborating on a series of nonfiction books about Westerns. And because of my background in film and television, our radars sort of crossed, and they invited me to take part in that series, a series of nonfiction books. So here's one of them, 52 Weeks, 52 Western Novels. And basically, this is a coffee table book that's just full of ideas about where you could start if you were interested in reading Westerns. So it's not necessarily a book that you would read from beginning to end. It's more like a reference book. So if you were interested in reading a Western but didn't know where to begin, you could flip through it and find something that appealed to you. So I worked on that. I worked on a sequel that was 52 Weeks, 52 Western television shows. I contributed a chapter to that book, and I also contributed a chapter to their book, 52 Weeks, 52 Western Movies. And all of these can be found on Amazon or ordered through your Barnes & Noble. But that was sort of my gateway drug into writing Westerns, because Scott Harris, who is deeply established in Western publishing, started coming out with collections of micro short stories. And the goal there was that he was going to publish short story collections. Each story was 500 words, so they're very short, like 2 pages long. And he just sort of invited people who had collaborated on the nonfiction books and other writers that he knew to submit pieces. And so I was one of the people that was invited to submit a piece to the first collection, which is called The Shot Rang Out, okay? And this is full of micro short Western stories by a variety of authors, some new Western authors like myself, and others, some very recognizable names that you would see on the shelf in Barnes & Noble. So I contributed a story to that, and I was fortunate enough to get it published. And the publisher of these, Dusty Saddle Press, wound up doing a whole series of short story collections like this. Okay, and each one of them, the authors were given a specific prompt that we had to use. So, for example, in The Shot Rang Out, we were given the prompt, the shot rang out, I heard the bottle crash, I heard her scream as the bottle crashed to the floor. So that phrase had to be used in every story, and that became the inspiration for these micro short stories. Similarly, the next collection was A Dark and Stormy Night. I also have a short story in this collection. And the first line of this, in keeping with, among other things, Snoopy in his writing, although that's not where it originated, it was a dark and stormy night. And so every story had to find a way to begin with that and incorporate that information in. So all in all, I contributed short stories that were published in 4 of these collections. And Julie was like a huge, huge help as an editor, because when I started writing these, I had never written something for such a short length before.
I would say at that time you were comfortable with like 1,200 words.
Oh, absolutely. And for at least those first 2 collections, I think that the stories, the first draft was also
They could have been
about
that big.
twice as long as they needed to be in order to be published. So Julie was great in helping me find like the spine of the story and sort of like continually shaping it and wheedling it back until I had something that was dramatic and worked, but was of an appropriate length. So
Everyone that you did, each time you approached that 500 word limit in a news story, you got better and better at writing to length.
Yep.
In
the
that
stories
form.
were tighter, and also like finding a premise that could fit 500 words,
Right.
which I think was my
Scope
my
is
biggest
always very
challenge.
difficult to define if you're trying to hit the mark like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to drink a little tea here, excuse me. Cut to the last story in the collection, which I don't actually have an author copy of yet, so I'm going to be reading off of a printout. All of these stories, even though they were 500 words, I would say I probably spent about 10 to 12 weeks on each of them. And so for the last one, I really felt like I had my feet under me. And I wanted to try something different and write a story that had comedy in it. Because comedy is as much about conflict as a Western or any other story. Like the humor comes from conflict usually. So I determined that I was going to write a Western that was a comedy. So I set out working on it, spent about 12 weeks working on it, and wasn't making the headway that I wanted to, but I felt like I knew where it was going and that it was going well. And then, and then I had a medical emergency, and I was in the hospital. And when that situation was resolved and I went back to work on the story, it wasn't funny to me anymore. Like, I just couldn't get into it. Pardon me. And so that's not a good place to be when a deadline is looming. And so I tried to go back and make it work, and I just couldn't do it. And I literally found myself in the place where
You had one day.
I had one day. Like I woke up on a Saturday, and the story was due on Sunday, and I had no story. So I either had to make it work or I had to bail. And so I was like, here's the thing. Like, the problem is I don't feel funny right now, you know, because I had sort of like a surprising and scary experience.
It wasn't a funny time.
No, it wasn't a funny time. So I was like, I need to find my sense of humor again, right? So I did something that, like, this is the kind of story that you hear writers tell all the time about how they locked themselves in a hotel room and they wrote something in 2 weeks. And mostly those stories are lies. Okay, that really doesn't happen. Writers are always trying to make something either seem easier than it was to write or harder, but they're never really telling the story in a way that tells you exactly what it was like, because usually it's a slog that you hope will have a happy ending, right? And we've all been there. So, but I had this deadline approaching the next day. I was like, the problem is I need to make myself laugh. And so Julie was having a cooking day.
Okay, during this time, whenever Eric's approaching a deadline, I'm a nervous wreck.
That's true. That's
And
true.
I am in the way a
Well,
lot.
because you want to be a help to me and you don't know what to do.
So I decided on this day that I was going to spend the entire day cooking
Yeah.
to
Which
keep
was
myself busy.
right, which was a good idea.
So
And
I got out the pots and pans and I left you to it.
Yep. And so, like, literally, we have a finished basement. I was like, I'm going to close the door. I'm going to lock myself in the basement, and I'm just going to see what happens. So I took my laptop down there, and I sat on the couch by the fireplace. And I just tried to find ways to make myself laugh. And what actually happened is that I recalled an idea for a Western story that had been sitting in the back of my brain probably for 15 years. And it had occurred to me at a time when I wasn't writing Westerns or even intending to write Westerns, so I never did anything with it, because the story sort of inherently had to be set in the West, sort of a cowboy story. And then I remembered that story was actually meant to be kind of funny. So I was like, well, this is great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sit down here. I'm going to put aside this other thing that I was trying to write so that it can, like, rest and cool off. I'm going to work on this just to see if I can make myself laugh, right? So I took this old premise and I started working on it, and my plan worked better than I thought that it was going to, because not only did I start getting into the story, but I started to make myself laugh. So I got into it. Well, the more I got into making myself laugh with the story, the more focused on this new story I became. And so the long and short of it is that I wrote this story more or less in a single draft in a single setting.
Folks, no, it was 4 hours. I cooked for 4 hours, and while I was cooking, he comes up from the basement and he reads me this.
Right.
Which was
And so-
mostly in this form at the
Right.
time.
There, you helped me with word choices and
couple.
phrasing to like really increase the impact. But this more than anything else was born more or less whole. And just for, for total honesty, that has happened to me twice in 20 years. Okay, it happened to me once in 1999, and then it happened to me again with the story in 2019. So that is not a common occurrence. But I'm very grateful that it played out that way because I got the story finished for the deadline. I turned it in, and it was accepted for publication in a short story collection called Time to Myself, which you can also find on Amazon and through Barnes & Noble. So I'm going to read my 500-word micro short story that came forth that day. All right. I'm also going to take another sip of tea. Right. Okay. So this story is The Car That Made Good in a Day by Eric Harper. You can't hang a man for stealing an automobile, I said. He's right, said Nelson, his authority somewhat diminished by the noose around his neck. Shut up, Nelson. This doesn't concern you, said Hayes, fixing his gaze on me. Go back to your newspaper, Evans, and leave the adjudicating to the experts. St. Eustace Hayes cut a bewildering figure on that hillside, a misshapen man, long of body and short of limb. To his chest clung a patinaed star, which bore witness to 40 years' administration of justice. A craft Hayes famously applied without moderation, reflection, or consistency. And completing the tableau stood Nelson, awaiting his final disposition on the bonnet of a Stutz Bearcat. The vehicle had been presented to Hayes by the Wisconsin Motor Manufacturing Company in recognition of his devotion to the cause of law and order. Or, as some suggested, in gratitude for a clandestine service he had performed. Or possibly as payment for his silence. A car is not like a horse, I persisted. He's right. I put up a hand to silence the accused. How dare you debate me? Hayes pounded the Bearcat, on a most basic tenet of common law. By this point, a small crowd had formed, including my photographer, Mr. Featherstone. A man's life may hinge on his horse, but an automobile is an affectation. Much more like a wife than a devoted animal, said Nelson. Hush, Nelson. An affectation, raged Hayes, who was very proud of his award. A hard-earned one, most certainly, I backstepped, seeing that I was in danger of hastening Nelson's execution. Would you accuse Mr. McKinley of affectation? Would you accuse Mr. Roosevelt of affectation? Mr. Roosevelt employed a horse at San Juan Hill, when accounted, as you may recall. In fact, it had been quite a circus getting the Bearcat up the hill to the nearest tree in order to deliver Nelson's sentence. I will have justice, Mr. Evans, and I shall set the precedent myself if necessary. And with that, Hayes gave the Bearcat a definitive slap. In the cockpit, a lever collapsed. The car eased forward and then, sensing its freedom, began to careen down the hill. Nelson made a go of prancing across the carriage until gravity betrayed him and he was displaced into the air. He made 2 full swings like a pendulum. On the zenith of the third, the tree limb gave way and Nelson, parallel to the ground and without access to his bound hands, landed flat on his face. The Bearcat regained its inertia far down the hill as Hayes whipped off his hat and threw it to the ground. There came a whoomp and a flash from Featherstone. Am I vindicated? Asked Nelson dazedly. Hayes, realizing he had been immortalized, said, I will not forget this, Evans. Nor will my readers. Later, reviewing Featherstone's photograph, I had some time to myself and some things to think about. What is justice, after all? And what is news? The end.
So, thank you very much for spending some time with us thinking about writing,
Yep.
the writing life, writing
Yep.
partners,
Yep.
and
I hope this has provided you some insights and something to think about. Thank you to Karen Schubert at Lit Youngstown for inviting us to take part in this video series, and of course for running an exceptional organization. Julie and I have attended the Lit Fest every year, and we have just found it to be very gratifying and very educational and just a lot of fun.
it's wonderful to be a part of such a community of writers in our area. It's the most supportive and accepting group of creative people that I've been a part of, and probably Eric has been a part of, and we just appreciate you all so much, and we look forward to seeing what other writer partners do behind the scenes every day while they're trying to get the work done.
That's right.
So thank you very much.
Have a nice day.